No, no lo tengo, voy a entrar a la silla académica.
Pues los que le tienen que leer, ¿no?
No lo leyeron en novela.
Yes, yes, that's my comment. I do this to protect it. We're going to start.
Hello, good evening, everyone. For those who are present in this room and those who are joining us via Zoom and YouTube, you are all equally welcome. As you all know, usually this event is held in Spanish, but this time we switch to English in order to welcome our guest for tonight, Professor Kostika Beradatan. Professor Beradatan is a Romanian-born American philosopher. He currently teaches philosophy at Texas Tech University, and he is also honorary research professor of philosophy at the University of Queensland, Australia. Besides, he is the author of several books, the most recent of which is titled In Praise of Failure, 4 Lessons in Humility. But his best known book is the one he is going to present here tonight, titled Dying for Ideas, Dangerous Lives of the Philosophers, which was recently translated into Spanish and published by Anagrama Publishing House under the title Morir por las ideas, la peligrosa vida de los filósofos. This text will be precisely the focus of our conversation today. Now we are going to use the time we have available as follows. Professor Beradatan will have between 35-40 minutes to present his book. Then our second guest will take the floor, Professor Carlos Patarroyo, also a philosopher and who teaches at the School of Human Science in our university, who will have about 15 minutes to comment on Professor Beradatan's presentation, to ask him some questions, and if necessary, to request some clarifications regarding the contents of the book. Afterwards, we will open the microphone so that attendees, both in person, face-to-face, and through virtual channels, can ask their own questions or make their own comments, either to our guest speaker or to our commentator. Having said this, I thank Professor Beradatan very much for having accepted the invitation to participate in this discussion. And on behalf of all my colleagues, I warmly welcome him to our institution, and I give him the turn for his intervention. The floor is yours then, Professor Beradatan. Welcome.
Muchas gracias, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a todos por venir aquí de presentarte. I'm not going to speak in Spanish, I just was pretend. I think, so the best way I thought to introduce the book is to present the introduction, which would kind of offer a summary of some kind of summary of the book's argument. And since the book is tied, the book's contents is connected, is tightly connected with the book's form, I'm going to actually read from that introduction, because the writing itself, the writing style, writing technique, and so on is part of the book. It's not some kind of packaging. The book comes with this. And then I'll be happy to, that kind of takes, 25 minutes, perhaps 30. And then we have enough time for, I'll give you more details if you like, answer questions, anything. I would very much prefer some kind of dialogical form. Please feel welcome to ask me anything. I'm going to.
Closer because it's, and use it as much as you can.
Okay.
Thank you. Gracias.
Socrates never wrote a line, yet his death was a masterpiece and he has kept his name alive. While he was living, Jan Palach, Czech student who set himself on fire in January 1969, protest against the Soviet occupation of his country, did not amount to much. After his fiery death, however, he became for many nothing short of a demigod, a creature of tremendous vitality and influence. From beyond the grave, Palach shaped Czechoslovakia's history. Whenever Mahatma Gandhi, would embark on yet another of his famous fast on to death, everything in India would become unusually lively, more vivacious than ever. During those fasts, I quote from a biographer, every change in Gandhi's physical condition was broadcast to every corner of the country. The whole of India lived Gandhi's hunger. Death, it seems, death does not always mean the negation of life. Sometimes it has the paradoxical capacity of enhancing it, of intensifying it to the point of, yes, breathing new life into life. The presence of death can instill in the living a new appreciation of existence, indeed, a deeper understanding of it. It would be fair to say then that life needs death. Should death be somehow outlawed, life would receive a devastating blow. First of all, life needs death for reasons of self-realization. It often happens that we realize how precious something is only when we lose it or are about to. It's the prospect of its sudden absence that teaches us how to appreciate the value and significance of its presence. So death can bring a new intensity to the act of living by its sheer proximity. Historians have noticed the curious fact that often when natural or social disasters with a high mortality rate, think of plagues, for example, or wars, strike, people seem more inclined to abandon themselves to worldly excesses. They pursue carnal pleasures, drinking, eating, sex, and so on, readily, with a sense of a newly discovered passion. Rather than acting cautiously to preserve resources as common sense would require in situations of crisis, they are quick to spend whatever is left to them, for they are in the greatest of rushes, this paper. They hurry to gorge on the pleasures of life at the very moment death approaches. What increases their lust for life is precisely the presence of death. The attitude may seem irrational, yet there is something marvelous about it. On the verge of annihilation, these people discover the miracle of existence and are celebrated. Giovanni Boccaccio's collection of novellas, the Decameron, offers us a glimpse, if an oblique one, into this unique situation. While the Black Plague death is ravaging Florence in 1348, a group of young people take refuge in a villa just a few miles away from the city and engage in 10 days of passionate living through vivid and salacious storytelling. The outcome is a collection of 100 tales celebrating life and joie de vivre at its most cardinal. Boccaccio intuits here the primordial connection between fear of death and desire. In limit situations, the proximity of death can be the most powerful of aphrodisiacs. Inspired perhaps by Georges Bataille, French historian Philippe Ariès speaks of a certain, I quote, erotization. Just like the sexual act, death comes to be seen, as I quote, as a transgression which tears man from his daily life in order to make him undergo a paroxysm, plunging him into an irrational, violent, and beautiful world. End of quote. That was one reason. We also need death in order to make better sense of life. In the absence of death, life would remain something boundless and shapeless, eventually tasteless. There would be no way to grasp life, because it would have no edges. Since to make sense of something is to be able to put it into a story, one's life has meaning insofar as it can be narrated. Just as a story without any end would be impossible, a life without death would be meaningless. In an essay he wrote some 8 years before his own death, Pier Paolo Pasolini makes precisely this point. I quote from Pasolini, it's absolutely necessary to die, he says, because so long as we live, we have no meaning. A search, and the language of our lives is untranslatable. That's what he says. It's just, I quote again, it's just a chaos of possibilities, a search for relations and meanings without resolution. To die is to give your life a sense of composition. Death is a skillful editor that puts your life together so that it comes across as something intelligible. An endless human life would be a mineral existence of sorts, something bloodless, undifferentiated, unuttered, as dead as a stone. You would spend it mindlessly, purposelessly, geological age after geological age. At a more practical level, even if such a life were possible, I'm not sure it would be desirable. As with any story, a biography, even the most interesting one that is stretched beyond a certain point, never fails to become boring. To stretch it even farther would be to court horror. If we were made immortal one, we might die of many reasons the next. There is finally another way in which death can dictate the dynamics of life. This is a subtler, more difficult case. Here, it's not your own death that shapes your life, but somebody else's. It's the type of annihilation I referred to at the beginning, the death of someone who chooses to die for a cause, for the sake of something bigger than oneself. Such a voluntary death affects the lives of those left behind in ways both profound and persistent. It directs their moral judgment, shapes their views on what matters, and pervades their understanding of what it means to be human. It ends up becoming a part of their cultural memory. Sometimes it even burdens their conscience and shapes them into doing so. Thanks to the perceived selflessness of those who made the ultimate sacrifice, their readiness to give up their own lives, some of these people end up projected into myth. Such a death often turns out to be the threshold where history ends and mythology begins. Human beings must have been dying for a cause for as long as they have been around. They have died for God or for their fellow humans, for ideas and ideals, for things real or imaginary, reasonable or utopian, of all the possible varieties of voluntary death. The book I'm presenting here is about philosophers who die for the sake of their philosophy, for their ideas. Dying such a death certainly does not lack irony. You pay with the most precious thing you've got, your own life, for what commonly passes as the least consequential activity. But philosophers, the most fascinating of them anyway, are nothing if not ironical. In a certain sense, this book, Dying for Ideas, is an exercise in an as yet uncharted ontology, the ontology of ironic existence. And then I have a section that's called As Good as Dead. And I'm presenting the heroes of There are five philosophers, and I will briefly introduce them. In 399, before Common Era, Socrates took poison after he was condemned to death by an Athenian jury. The charges were corrupting the youth and impiety. During his trial, Socrates made it clear that regardless of its outcome, he was not going to change the way he lived his life and practice his philosophy. After the trial and before execution, Socrates would still have saved his skin with help from his wealthy friends. Out of loyalty to his city's laws, however, he refused to flee. In 415 Common Era, Hypatia, a pagan woman philosopher from Alexandria, was brutally murdered by a mob of Christians, instigated by the city's patriarch Cyril. By 415, Hypatia had become a unique intellectual presence, as well as an influential teacher in the city. Even the governor, Orestes, though a Christian, actively sought her company and counsel. Apparently, Cyril was not happy with Hypatia's influence in the city and in Orestes' circle. In 1535, Sir Thomas More was beheaded in the Tower of London after he was found guilty of high treason. What constituted treason was More's refusal to swear an oath of allegiance to the Act of Succession, whereby the succession to the throne of England was passed to the future Elizabeth I, the yet unborn child, Henry VIII, had conceived with his new wife, Anne Boleyn. And also he failed to recognize, he refused to recognize the crown's supremacy in matters of religious. As a mere human being, furthermore, a king cannot, or anybody for that matter, a king cannot be the head of the church, because, I quote, no temporal man may be the head of spirituality, end of quote. In 1500s, just some decades later, in 1500s, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in Rome after he was sentenced to death by the Holy Office, by Inquisition, of the Catholic Church. He had spent the previous 8 years in the Inquisition's prisons in Venice and then in Rome. A Dominican friar, he was still technically a friar, but Bruno was condemned for holding beliefs contrary to the orthodoxy of the church in such matters as transubstantiations, the Trinity, the divinity and incarnation of Christ, and the virginity of Mary. He stubbornly refused to repent, even on his way to the stake. Now, coming into the 20th century, in 1977, Jan Patočka, a Czech phenomenologist, a direct disciple of Edmund Husserl, died of apoplexy in a Prague hospital after an 11-hour-long interrogation at the hands of the Czechoslovakian secret police. Patočka was being investigated for his role in the founding of a human rights movement, Charter 77, deemed subversive by the communist regime. He felt, however, that his involvement in the movement was necessary if he was to remain faithful to his philosophical ideas. Now, what kind of a philosopher does one have to be to die for an idea? Well, what these people, and others, of course, have in common, in spite of their specific beliefs and so on, is a commitment to the notion that philosophy is above all, is something you practice. Sure, it involves thinking and writing, reading and talking, but this activities should not be seen as an end in themselves. They need to serve the final purpose of philosophy, which is that of self-realization. Your philosophy is not something you store up in your books, but something you carry with you. It's not just a subject you talk about, but something you embody. The notion has been called philosophy as a way of life or as an art of living. Now, what philosophy as an art of living often boils down to is paradoxically learning how to die, how to face death, an art of dying. The best example is Socrates himself. He understood philosophy as a way of life and practiced it in such an uncompromising way that it led him straight to his death. His disciple Plato was so affected by what the Athenians did to his master that in his dialogue Phaedo, dialogue purportedly recording Socrates' last hour before his execution, Plato skillfully advances an understanding of philosophy as nothing but, I quote, nothing but preparation for death, meditata natura. Chronologically now, Phaedo belongs to Plato's middle period, sometime after Socrates' death. So years, we can imagine. It would be tempting to see this definition as an act of philosophical justice. A still grieving, unhealed, perhaps even angry Plato smuggles the devastating event of his master's ending into the very definition of philosophy. Now, philosophical justice or not, Plato's notion gives voice to a crucial insight. Philosophy is an art of living only to the extent that it offers us an art of dying. The Platonic definition has had resonance right through the present. The 16th century, Michel de Montaigne, echoing Cicero, would write in one of his essays, quote, that to philosophize is to learn how to die. In the 20th century, Simone Weil would place death at the center of her philosophical project. According to her, to Weil, knowing how to die is even more important than know how to live. For death, says Weil, I quote, is the most precious thing which has been given to man. The supreme impiety is to make a bad use of it. To waste our death, in a certain sense, we would have lived for nothing. Now, the book which I'm presenting here is about how a philosopher can make a good use of her death, and how, in so doing, she resignifies her life and makes her work good. Marginal as the notion of philosophy as an art of living may be in today's mainstream philosophical circles, the idea doesn't lack in attraction. Indeed, there's something satisfyingly consistent about a definition of philosophy that presupposes perfect symmetry between word and deed, thought and practice, and which is all about self-realization. That is the notion that the philosopher's self is a work in progress, something she creates through philosophizing. At the same time, however, this is a dangerous idea because it can get those who take it seriously in trouble. Socially, a philosopher committed to philosophy as an art of living is often what Greeks call paresiastes, a radical straight talker. Part of her job is to not keep her mouth shut. And paresia has rarely led its practitioners to happiness. Indeed, to embrace the notion of philosophy as a self-transformative practice is to make yourself fundamentally vulnerable. If a philosophy is genuine only to the extent that it's embodied in the one who practices it, then the philosopher is not unlike the tightrope walker performing without a safety net. The philosopher's life is a perpetual balancing act. The slightest wrong step, one side or the other, could be fatal. If the philosopher accommodates the demands of the world at the price of a disconnect with his philosophy, he is lost. If he obeys the demands of his conscience at the cost of his personal life and safety, he is lost again. This is precisely the situation that Socrates, Hypatia, Bruno, Thomas More, and Patočka faced. At one point in their lives, these philosophers had to make a choice. Either they remain faithful to their philosophy and die, or renounce it and remain alive. The exact details may have differed. Some of them were specifically asked to desist and repent, while others were just given to understand that they should stop or else. The fundamentals of the situations, however, are the same. And so is the precariousness of this philosopher's type of walking. Dying for ideas as being born out of a fascination with their perilous performance, their dangerous performance. The significance of the choice between dying to remain faithful to your ideas on one hand, and changing your philosophy to remain alive on the other hand, cannot be overestimated. Since for these thinkers, philosophy is not just a body of doctrines that you can in principle keep quiet about or even discard, but a way of life, something that has pervaded your entire biography, the choice carries considerable existential weight. Since philosophy is embodied in the philosopher, to give it up would be to tear her apart. The philosophers facing such a choice soon realizes, in fact, realizing that what's at stake here is not just a matter of avoiding the hypocritical position. The choice, in fact, conceals a test. If it's not to remain just talk, just empty talk, philosophy needs to pass the test of life, the test of practice, showing in hindsight an uncanny precise. Patochka described the situation in unambiguous terms. And I'm quoting from him again. Philosophy reaches a point, he says, where it no longer suffices to pose questions and answer them, both with extreme energy, where the philosopher will make progress no further unless he manages to make a decision. End of quote. We need that. We need to look at philosophy with new eyes. Ultimately, philosophizing is not about thinking, speaking, or writing, not even about performing them in a bold, courageous fashion, but about something else, deciding to put your body on the line. In this book, I follow as closely as I can the inner workings of this decision process, as well as what happens to the philosophers' bodies as they are being put on the line. These philosopher situations are worth recalling in some detail. One day, they found themselves in what must have been a profoundly disturbing position. As sophisticated speakers, they now had to realize that arguing and debating was out of the question. Masters of logic and persuasion, they are now in a place that had no such use of arguments. Sophisticated or not, here they were in all the nakedness of their predicament, unable to do the one thing they have been doing all their lives. Whether in a clear or a more obscure manner, these thinkers must have realized that if they were not to be completely silenced, they needed something stronger than words to make themselves understood. And in a limit situation like this, intense, straightforward, stark, what was stronger than words was their own death. With the spectacle of their dying bodies alone, they had to express whatever they could not communicate to all their rhetorical mastery. Throughout his life, Socrates has spoken persuasively, yet he died even more persuasively. His death was the most effective means of persuasion he ever devised, to such an extent that many centuries later, he is remembered not so much for what he did when he was alive, but precisely for the way he died. It's telling them that it's most radical. When it comes to its final test, philosophy has to abandon its ordinary routines, speaking, writing, teaching, and so on, and turn into something else, performance, bodily performance. We've thus come full circle. Living philosophically presupposes the body, but so does the philosophy. These philosophers need the body, but not only to practice their philosophy, but more importantly, to validate it. In this book, in Dying for Ideas, I examine, in a manner that hasn't been tried before, the philosophers' dying bodies as the testing ground of their thinking. So these philosophers choose a path that leads them to dying eloquent death, which are subsequently constructed as a culmination of their philosophical projects. Whatever these thinkers' work may otherwise have been, in light of their ending, there's a sense in which it's incomplete. Their work is incomplete if we dissociate it from the way in which they died. Indeed, such a death is a philosophical work in its own right, sometimes a masterpiece. The manner of Socrates' death, for example, has become such an inalienable part of his philosophical heritage, that it's hard to imagine him dying of old age in his own bed. As time passes and the memory of their deaths start haunting subsequent generations, this philosopher's endings take on more and more layers and meaning. Eventually, they end up in mythology. And the next section is called philosophical mythology. Fortunately, philosophers are rarely killed for what they think. Since, as a rule, they are not taken too seriously, most of the 9 philosophers are safe, and the price they have to pay for their straight talking rarely exceeds the cost of a few stitches. However, as rare as they may be, their voluntary death, whenever they occur, are worth paying attention to, because they exert a tremendous influence on subsequent generations. The martyr philosophers, end up casting a very long shadow over those who come after, who cannot but feel indebted to and intimidated by the great deed. The memory of their deaths never quite fades away. Indeed, it's preserved and exacerbated with every new generation. As a result, these thinkers often become more active posthumously than they were in their lifetime. In posterity, they acquire brand new lives, which sometimes have little to do with their actual biographies. An important question that I ask in the book, therefore, is what exactly lies behind such an extraordinary influence? It cannot be the intrinsic qualities of their philosophy. After all, Socrates never wrote anything to be read after his death. From Hypatia, nothing has survived. And Giordano Bruno is hardly read today. What then? What gives these philosophers such an impact? Socrates ended. Voltaire once said, quote, "The death of this martyr was actually the apotheosis of philosophy." Leaving aside the irony that such a statement implies, here he is, the famous anti-clerical thinker, speaking like a man of the cloth. Voltaire, maybe even without realizing it, points to an explanation. For it's precisely the martyrdom of these thinkers that shapes their posterity and alters our perceptions. Even many centuries after the event of their death, still blinds us and makes us misinterpret what exactly they did or wrote when they're alive. Indeed, their death turns out to be of such a unique nature that resonates through some of the deepest layers of our psyche, where our primary impulses and drives reside. We end up processing the event of this philosopher's ending, not through our intellectual faculties, but through our religious imaginary. Strictly rational as our approach to them proposed to be, there's always something obscure and irrational at its root that eventually shape the way we relate to the speaker. This happens for at least two different yet complementary reasons. First, the phenomenological level. In the presence of someone who commits to dying for a cause, what we experience is a powerful mix of emotions, of attraction and repulsion, fascination and terror, all at the same time. Their readiness to die places them in a space inaccessible to most of us. By doing what they are doing, these people cut themselves off from all human society. This is precisely the original meaning of the sacred, sakya, that which is cut off from the rest, which is profane, which is set apart, and towards which we feel this uncanny mix of opposite emotions. In other words, someone who performs such an act places herself in a sacred mode of being. We are viscerally, profoundly, unsettled, because our participation in the event, even when vicarious and mediated, activates in us the primordial experience of the sacred. That's why martyrdom has always played such an important role in the constitution of religion, and also why radical forms of political protest, such as self-immolation, can sometimes have extraordinary effects on society. Second, if we choose to adopt a more sociological perspective, the philosopher's violent death can be understood with the help of René Girard's theory of sacrifice. Community in crisis, caught up in an endless cycle of violence, needs a scapegoat victim to find its peace. Society, says Girard, society is seeking to deflect upon a relatively indifferent victim, a sacrificial victim, the violence that would otherwise be vented on its own members. End of quote. If that happens successfully, the sacrificial murder is followed by some kind of sacralization. Thanks to what Girard calls the scapegoat mechanism, the victim turns into a powerful agent of social change. Whereas initially, the victim was totally powerless, having to absorb the community's aggression and violent impulses, now she has been elevated to a position of significant power. The scapegoat, says Girard, no longer appears to be merely a passive receptacle for evil forces, but is rather the mirage of an omnipotent manipulator shown by mythology. Most important of all, such a death, martyr's death, dying for idea, most important of all, such a death not only heals the community in the midst of which it occurs, but it also comes to be seen as a founding murder. A new beginning has thus made possible through the death, the sacrificial death. Girard uses the example of Moses, Oedipus, Romulus, and others. This may explain why most martyr philosophers have been construed as founders of various philosophical traditions. Socrates is seen as nothing less than the originator of Western philosophy. Those before him are tellingly only pre-Socratics. Hypatia is placed at the outset of the tradition of women in philosophy, even though there were women philosophers before, where she's taken to be the founder of philosophical feminism, even if it's hard to know what she would have said about feminist issues. Similarly, Giordano Bruno is sometimes regarded as having founded a grand tradition of modern free thinking, as well as a brand of anti-religious rationalism in modern Europe. There is great irony there. Rarely did the modern philosopher believe in magic and other obscurantist things more intensely than Bruno. Such examples point to an important fact. The formation of intellectual and philosophical traditions is not governed by strictly rational patterns, but sometimes by forms of mythical thinking and imagination. The violent event of this philosopher's death is registered and processed by the tradition along the lines of myth-making. As a result, their endings are translated into mythology. Invisibly, but tenaciously, then the logic of the myth marks the way the history of thought takes shape. Conventionally, we tend to think that myth subverts reason, but it must be more complicated. As the example of this martyr philosophers show, sometimes myth complements reason. Just as myth-making and mythic imagination brings to philosophy a degree of human complexity, sophistication, and depth that reason alone is never able to secure. And I'm now going right into my ending, my conclusion. That's basically the gist of the story I seek to tell in the book. In an important sense, however, dying for ideas is not about making arguments. That's the gist of the argument. The book we are talking about is not about making arguments. Indeed, at the core of this book, there lies a conviction that philosophy proper is not even about writing books. So what I'm saying here is self-defeating. No doubt philosophy needs writing, and good writing can do it a great service. Yes, in relation, what philosophy ultimately is, writing is bound to remain something preliminary. For no matter how good philosophers are as writers, their philosophy does not lie in their writing, but elsewhere. In a certain sense, philosophy begins where writing ends. Writing is rehearsal, dress rehearsal at best, but not yet performance. Philosophy is performance. Thank you. That was basically the introduction, which presents the book's main argument. Then follows what you have next is the number of chapters. I'll be happy to answer any questions. It's a mixture. It's a kind of a hybrid product. It's a mixture of storytelling, which I start practicing here, then I took up later, and intellectual history and biography and other things.
Thank you. Should you take a seat, please? Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Professor Posti Cabrata, for coming all the way down here, for accepting our invitation, and for talking to us about this very, very interesting book, which I really enjoyed reading, I have to say. Actually, the photo that it's in the picture doesn't make justice to Professor Cabrata, because he looks like upset. Like, he's the kindest person in the world. So instead of a long commentary to your book, I would like to ask a couple of questions in hopes that then the audience decides to make some of their own.
Very much encouraged.
And I would like to start by your ending, because at the very end of your introduction, you say that philosophy begins where writing ends. Writing is rehearsal. Dress rehearsal at best, but not yet performance. Philosophy is performance. Somewhere in the introduction, you also ask, what kind of philosopher is the one that dies for his ideas? You said that philosophy is not something that you write. You need writing, but it's not there. Philosophy is something that you have to live. Philosophy is a way of life. So the true philosopher should be someone who becomes his ideas in a way, embody his ideas. Yes, that's a way. And later on the first chapter, I'm thinking that you say something like, philosophy brings change with it. Philosophy changes you, and then you say something pretty harsh. You say, if you're a bit too comfortable with yourself, if there is nothing you're ashamed of, you don't need philosophy. You're fine. So the whole idea is that philosopher has to be someone who doesn't have this abyss between what he thinks and what he does. But at some point, because it looks like a really harsh affirmation, at some point during the first chapter, you make like an intermission in which you say, but you imagine a person contradicting you. Say, well, philosophy is a job. I mean, I can live my philosophical boundaries at the office at 5 p.m. and then go live my life, and I don't have to torment myself with that. But your answer immediately is, but think of Heidegger, right? So Heidegger writes Time and Being, and then joins the Nazi Party. And you say, that upsets you. Does it upset you because the German men joined the Nazi Party, or because the philosopher joined the German party? And you think that we are going to say it's because of the philosopher. But my question goes to this, the fragmentation of philosophy. When you follow Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions, all sciences have to specialize in order to grow. Philosophy is no exception to that. So nowadays, you have people that does philosophy of logic, for example, and they are deep centered in philosophy of logic. how can you ask someone like that to live by the principles and to be coherent with risking their body, as you put it, or I don't know, for political revolution or something like that? Because then it looks like all they're doing is, I mean, it's no offense to whoever does philosophy of living, but it doesn't look as I would say that Wilson and Vega will have a problem with that because they do ethics, right? So they're in the middle of the discussion. But someone who does philosophy of language and are studying Rice's implicatures, perhaps they're not as in the front line of these type of discussions. There are some other people. So how can you expect them to be this type of, I wouldn't say martyr, but someone who puts his body on the line, even though they don't seem to be in that kind of discussion?
Thank you. Where should I start? Thank you. Well, that's totally true. You should perhaps see this book. That's actually dies, you die in progress. You have to specialize, expert to gain knowledge, which is typically narrow. But still, I cannot ignore that. That's something new, right? Once, like 20 years or more, but still, it's kind of always history. That's kind of 20th century. It was before, but it kind of became in the 21st century. So that's new. Horizon here is actually involves a grand tradition of thinking where you have ancient Greece, you have centuries of thinking, you have Chinese, Indian. We have that kind of philosophy that's difficult to distinguish. Okay? This, when philosophy tries to stand for this stupid. So I'm confident. That's my timeline. So that means that we're getting a chance. I should have obvious to be more careful with language, but then again, we have to go way out that position. The operating on the language that philosophy, very broad sense, and end up writing extended. I quite doing something, So you have the person about as again in the earlier we have to see dissatisfaction there, and that and the next one and probably whatever we're writing. My own dissatisfaction with treatments, especially for word, which has become very narrow, remote because you have to useless. Now there are different kinds of uselessness. Philosophy in that tradition certainly has its own particular uselessness. Philosophy doesn't make you rich. Philosophy doesn't make you culturally respectable. So you do philosophy, when you do philosophy, you do something socially useless. So I allow that kind of uselessness. But I'm closer to what I was talking about. Philosophy has become useless in medieval because of their specialized. That's part of my critique. I'm not sure we are, again, I'm coming from a certain environment. I think we are lost by becoming more specialized. We become more scientists. we have lost a lot, and we've lost including the respect of other scientists, other scholars, and theorists. And sometimes it's good to have a kind of vague, imprecise or the Constitution have. And I'm not sure it happens, it will happen, it's happening, but I'm not question, I'm not sure if that's the right way to see. That's the job of science. Always, which are for example, you gain information. Then I'm not sure if that will happen. The philosophy should have. It does. I mean, it's still that what happens. I have my own questions. I'm not sure. Once you gain that, I guess, become less specialized or self-ironic, self-deprecating, more playful, more unserious, more not sure if I answered the question.
Thank you. I'm not sure I agree completely, but I understand. Thank you very much. I see a pattern on your work, at least on your later work, because there's some things that you say in this book that resound again on your latest book on Price of Failure. You seem to have a quarrel with this new wave of positivism understood as everything's good, everything's happy, everything, not logical positivism, but this thing with entrepreneurship, which is the fashion of the time, and these entrepreneurs saying stuff like you should change yourself, and you should, and these changes you have to be born again and look for, and then you make a warning in this book in which you say, be careful, because whenever philosophy gives you that radical change, you are not born again, new.
No,
you are refurbished or renewed. And you said a renewed person is necessarily a shattered person. There's something broken in there. There's a past and there's a future. There's nostalgia there. It's not necessarily a happy story. Can you elaborate on that? Because that goes against everything that you heard nowadays with all this type of self-help new wave in which you should change yourself. What's the matter? There's no problem doing that. And you say it comes with a price.
Yeah, I'm glad you noticed Anthony books in that respect. Yeah, I am. I came to the point in writing in Presentación where I was afraid that the publisher would cancel the book. It was becoming very anti-commercial, publishing, and that this is money making, and that rather, but then I'm glad I didn't. Because I guess I realized I could make even more money. Well, the whole thing here is to engage the more pessimistic, the big pessimism says. Life is dark. Life is fundamentally dark. There's some flashes of goodness, and some flashes of hope, some flashes of happiness that can happen. But the general background against our lives, so get to that. We start, we come from the and we go into nothingness. Unless you are a believer, you have a strong personal belief, you believe in something not the classic, or existence. If you are, unless you are, and that's a different story. We don't know that story. That's the province of religion, province of all the province. Can you also be the province Yes, business member, transhumanism. Just to make the right economy, invest the money in the right place, you can buy yourself immortality. That's a different story. Think of plans, I guess. But if you ignore that, and if we cannot really, we are not lucky enough to be believers, then we are stuck. We're stuck with this world, which is a dark place, in which whatever is promising, whatever is bright, has to be extracted from dark darkness and weaknesses from dark stuff. So I'm really, so if we bring that into philosophy and if we engage more seriously with that kind of stuff, I think we have to adopt a more pessimistic behavior and reconsider, revalue many of the things. Of course, the guru, the self-help guru, the entrepreneurs and so on, they have all interest, to programs because that's their business. That's how they make money. That's fine. If there are people buying their stuff, that's fine. They're happy to do so. But as serious thinkers, more sober thinkers, I think we are more responsible. We have this responsibility to comment whatever informs whatever is done, whatever is intelligence, whatever is finite. Secondly, disturbing, whatever the nothingness that lurks, it's something that all religions have. What I try to sketch in this book and the next one, and one after, is some kind of secularized religions. We are in the sense of addressing the big questions. We don't need to have the right answer, we don't have to have any answers, but we have an obligation to ask those big questions. And once you do that, as long as you do that, you are on a spiritual quest. Whether you're a philosopher, a scientist, a religious person, an artist, that's my definition, my own definition. You don't have to be a believer, go to churches. Spirituality can happen outside. It's a space at the intersection of philosophy, science, religion, and so on, where people meet. The minds meet, individual minds meet to trust this whether there is this kind of. So, and in that space is not a space of academics. It's not a space of more talk. So what you are the context is about the use of thing. We have, I was so tired, so I just finished the book here, and at some point, at the beginning, maybe it's a nautical, a very important thinker, it's very serious, really bad. And so on. Because I was disgusted by the way in which that quote has been hijacked and transformed and rebranded and reframed by all those gurus. So I made at some point, I needed to simply ignore the kind of, the boycott, which at first it have been wrong. Eventually, I worked with it, and I went back to it. Which is very difficult. So that is very difficult because some we have try to fail, try again, better. And that's where that kind of thing stop. But then Beckett something it says something else. What do you do better? Getting worse and worse and worse. You're sick. So that actually the horizon, the context point in Beckett points to a much darker, much more serious, much more profound context, which I think again is very complementary to the design. People in the center industry talk about it. So that's actually again kind of fun.
Okay, thank you. I have a bunch of questions. I will ask one more before I give the audience a chance to ask some questions. You said it at the introduction, you read it actually, that Socrates never wrote a word, and the testimony was already there. Giordano Bruno is hardly read today. So what is so special about them that they decided to die? And you ask yourself, well, how does that death changes things? And you said that by dying for what they believed, they separated themselves from us, and they entered that sacred aura, kind of a special place, and that we regard them with attraction and repulsion, with terror and fascination. In a secular time like this, what would that mean? Why this sacred? What kind of sacred are you referring to? If it's not divine in that sense, it's like an admirable thing that perhaps I know I'm not going to do. So perhaps that looks like I admire it.
I have an example. Some years ago, 10 years ago, the Arab Revolution, remember how it starts in Tunisia. Man set up to on fire. Celebration. So what you have, the biggest was paid. So people are in the middle of a community. That's a very good example of it's used in so that is instance of this kind of stabilization of just true. Somebody commits that unconvenient, right? That can go on higher and $20. And by doing so, he will show that care of what's really precious so life. He's made his sacrifices. And that means in the others, the audience, witnesses. It's this hard thing, but being present in the presence of something unworthy, of something unusual, sacred. That shocks you. Now that's interesting because I studied that thing. I was mentioning for a few years ago, it was in Tunisia, and then it was in Tibet, with some number of monks, there, practice. What happens is there's a very interesting situation. As soon as the second person does the same thing, you don't have that special moment, the special mixture, that moment of sacredness. It's copied. It's like a source copy. It's not the original. The original has to remain unique. And of course, we use example music. It was a big deal. It was a very big deal. In part because it was captured by cameras, by journalists, and had a huge impact. Was devastating across countries, across regions, across the world, because that person, the performing unique, ultimate gestures, crosses, the line, crosses the line between humanity and something else. Humanity and basically transcends humanity right there. That's like a moment of, that's a rare moment of sacredness in the midst of our secular world. So They can happen. There are some of them that they are not, of course, very common. Otherwise, it's extraordinary, rare, special. So we had some even in recent history.
Thank you. I don't know if there are any questions from the audience. You can ask the question in Spanish or the right and understand Spanish. Please.
What would be the difference between the philosopher who dies for an idea and the revolutionary who dies for an idea? And also the difference between the philosopher who dies for an idea and the religious fanatics who die for an idea. Because it seems I don't see clearly both dies for ideas. So what would be the difference between them?
Thank you. What I have in the book, I have a large chapter on that. So kind of there is a continuum, dying for a cause, or unusual, voluntary death. So before I get to the philosophers who died, I discuss martyrdom in Christianity and Islam. So it's a kind of a long discussion of what it means to die. Early Christian martyrs, what they went in their lives. It's a very interesting moment in history. And then Muslims, so you get the, so this, later on, you would have students where, and then I know a number of things, right? Something I learned about the revolution, that's a good example. So then I think the philosopher's case is one part. I'm not saying it's something that I absolutely need or heard. It's a type of time, false. It's a specific type of voluntary death. And what's specific about it is a continuity that exists between philosophers and century, right? And his own, her own intellectual evolution, his own or her own set of values, whatever they have been preaching for a long time. That's pretty fundamental. But it's not like these are not whimsical moments. Like you have philosophers in one day out of the blue, that person decides to die with some idea. What's there is a growth. It's a continuity. Socrates. So you have this guy for decades behaves in a certain way. Have certain beliefs. That got in trouble. People got became more and more secretarian. And your friends among them. As even if that good friends, it eats us. So that question, the type of philosophical life, pushes him into that orbit one day where he has to make a choice or he has to make a choice. Look, he had to either become and by himself, his own life, his own project, and say, okay, I'm going to start. It will happen again. So I was wrong. For decades, what I did was wrong. I'm not going to do anything. That would have been his own self-annihilation. That would have been much worse one than his actually. What he chose instead of what we now, he chose to stay consistent. I think that consistency is something that. So it has to be this build-up for decades. We have in all cases in my book, Socrates and Epictetus, the sense of inner growth, inner continuity, and serious continuity of the ideas, and consistency, and the notion that doing otherwise at that particular moment would be to be now. So that's one approach. Then I have one difference I didn't want to manage. In the book, I consider religious sayings, those who are become saints. What's interesting here is that in religion, by definition, people die were dead in the hope that they would receive, they would get something. Okay. It's fundamental. There's this contract, martyrological contract between man and God. Look, God, and don't die for it. You have to give me mortality to become your children and so on. So this is martyrological attack, where the future martyr goes through that process. And he has a lot of way. Whereas in philosophy is very interesting because not always, but in many cases, those philosophers do not believe in mortality. So they die little for nothing. They don't expect. We don't have these Thomas More was Catholic, he was a good Catholic, expecting mortality and so on. But we don't have that in many cases. Giordano Bruno, for example, he believed in his own immortality. And we can easily recognize we have in Socrates, of course, a discussion in our immortalities. But that's not necessary. A philosopher would not die because he or she expects some kind of reward, so that kind of death would not do, but they die because they cannot do otherwise. Also, you mentioned politicians, revolutionaries, we have okay, for a politician, point of market, he or she dies for the community. I'm dying for the community. I'm not revolutionary. I'm dying so that their life will be better. But in the philosopher stage, you don't have that. Either he or she is one individual. There's no clear relationship with the community. On the contrary, the community would go after. They would be the victims. They would be very often the community will be either convinced or very involved in the giving. You have in the authorities, you have the community. It happens, and that's dead. So there's no sense of ability to community there, which Socrates wanted. It's but just a bit different because there is a community there in the sense that his victimizers were not the dead people, the victimizer was the government. So it's not, but the community was tired. They should have kept so should have acted, and they didn't. That made much
Beta.
Thank you, Professor Brotherton. It's very suggestive your talk. I have the same question to Wilson about the fanatism and the difference between fanatism and these kind of philosophers. And actually, when you say that, okay, there is one difference that is a commitment with coherence or consistency. Actually, I was thinking also in the example of the 47 running samurais, because the honor they decide to die. But I think that it is a kind of commitment with consistency. So I was thinking that there is another difference that to say that it's a commitment with something, and this commitment is with a specific kind of life that you say, and in specific related with the first question and answer that Carlos made, is a commitment with broad sense of philosophy that is related with wisdom and with the commitment to truth and with know yourself. So I was thinking if maybe the title of your book, the dangerous life of philosophers is narrow, and actually the title maybe could be like the dangerous life of being into the philosophy in that sense. But because you have some examples, Hypatia and Socrates. Socrates is a very specific example because he tried. He had the opportunity to save himself, but he refuses. He refuses. But yes, I think that is not the philosophers themselves. It's the kind of life that is committed with the main principle to know yourself. Maybe
that example. That kind of goes back to your question, Carlos. So to go there, I had first to introduce, I did the introduction, but I didn't know it's chapter on positivism. Because that would kind of solve the problem. So the process can be academic exercise with specialization, over specialization. That's fine. But there's a different facets in ancient Greece where philosophy is mostly experimental practice. It's something we do. So it really has to that kind of it's a so once you so I read the age of Foucault, Plato, Stoics, and so on. But it's a long chapter. Philosophy is aware of these fundamentals. That's the consistency. You get some once you choose that, you start liking it, practicing it. You get stuck there. There's no way back. No turning forward. You have to keep practicing. You have to die. And that's the title. That's funny because that's not the title. What happens if you know something in the interest? Not even your editor. So you work with an editor who is typically somebody very, not necessarily especially, but the converse, your specialty. So you work with an editor who has a good intellectual background and can follow your arguments, writing. But the title of this big process in the side by will never guess the marketing. But now, there are special people with every single class that they should. You can propose some different possible titles, and they may or may not choose one. So if I remember correctly, I have a first title was Lost is Not. I thought it was cool, it was attractive. And then some point came back from one of his offices. Now, I'm from and yeah, I tend to go, I tend to listen because they know their readers, know their what counts, what passes for. But it's tricky. It's tricky. I know. I've been involved in books different ways. I have serious elsewhere. And some authors are really insistent that they love their titles and they don't trust anybody. Don't let anybody else, mess up with their and I tell them, no, that you have to give up. That's not something you choose. It's not your right. Your job is to write the book, not to write the title.
Is there any other question for Professor?
I think so.
Which one? Can you approach? Because I don't think that the microphone is going away with Yes, I will.
Sí, es que respecto a toda la conversación y todo, se me vienen en la mente ciertos casos de ciertos filósofos y ciertos números que me resultan particulares frente a esta idea de morir por las ideas. Y es que me pregunto cómo, ¿qué pasa con cuando las circunstancias de cierta vida en particular no permiten que la idea de su filosofía como que surja? Pienso mucho en el caso de, por ejemplo, Nietzsche, que su vida tal vez es muy contraria a una filosofía de la voluntad, del poder, de la fuerza, de la vigorosidad, y su vida, el final de su vida termina siendo pues todo lo contrario a lo que su filosofía es. Entonces, ¿cómo pensar estas contradicciones entre la circunstancia de la vida de cierta persona, cierto filósofo, y pues sus ideas más filosóficas? También lo pienso mucho en el caso de Deleuze, y pensar este ser como un devenir constantemente, y que su suicidio haya sido sucumbir ante el dolor, entendiéndose como un devenir, porque sucumbir a una parte como el dolor tan abruptamente para suicidarse. Entonces, esas contradicciones entre, digamos, el vivir, la filosofía como se piensa, y ese vivir circunstancial que le toca a ellos, me parece como, ¿cómo pensaríamos eso en relación con esto, en morir con las ideas?
Super. Gracias. So, I don't know if you got it. You got
I
it?
think I did, yeah. Yeah, it's a lot has, yes, a lot of it has to do with circumstances, each other. So we do have, of course, those cases where Nietzsche, as we said, he could not even commit suicide. Not one day finds himself in a place where that's out of the best. He doesn't even have a thinking, let alone putting that in practice. But it's a lot of, as I said, it's a lot of, so it's not a general, it's not a general theory of philosophers. So it's a very depends from case to case, from society to society, from individual philosopher to individual philosopher. And also it has to do with, in the book I have, it's in a much more figurative way, a sense of crisis. So those cases, those, market, taking market, don't just happen today. I'm not sure today, some philosopher would try, I'm not sure before. Because we need a sense of societal crisis. So I used energy hard. His theory was that there is a precondition, there is a sense of the crisis in society. Society, that society for sure, I think, has to go first to a sense of crisis, distrust. Everybody is against everybody. There is this consumer violence. So at some point, there is this, in Gerard, it's kind of conscious that it is an interesting process. So there's something anthropological in us that somehow humans discover the crisis by singling out one individual, a weak individual, somebody without defense, somebody whose murder wouldn't mean much. And that person becomes a victim. And even that puts an end to the crisis, that victim becomes a medical victim. And that you have found, that's where you have found. But those are rare. So that's why it depends on the case. I have in the book, I have the kind of sketch the context of what it is, the circumstances of the war, the start happens in the Christian world. Sandra discussed with the Roman authorities, whatever was going on in Sandra, and Thomas More, England. So we do, it has a really human affairs. It doesn't work like in maths, like in engineering, you have a certain combination of factors, something it works. It's humanity. We operate very similarly. So the individual circumstances of the society, of the circumstances, of the individual philosopher involved, of that person's psychology and personal dispositions matter a lot. Did I?
Yes. Sí, ¿no? Cristian.
me gustaría preguntar si tienes alguna idea o comentario particular sobre la muerte de Walter Benjamin. Y pongo este caso porque en ocasiones se lo ha presentado como si fuera como la decisión de un hombre vencido por las circunstancias, pero desde esta perspectiva tal vez hay alguna otra fuerza vital allí en esa última.
It's a good, of course, so it's not only about many others. So I'm so interested in that story, and such a story. I was about to stupid death and stupid in the world, but because it looks like there's a chance he could have escaped, and he did. He had the poison with him, and he couldn't have. But he was afraid he was hunted down by the Nazis. They were after him. They were doing that, wanted to escape, wanted to have a meeting for his own death, his own choice. But it's not only here. It's one case, but also we have it's a very serious issue. I mean, we have that's kind of heroic. That's unusual. Although the man of Germany, the whole empire coming after you, but then we can very easily imagine a situation where I have a terminal disease, I have a cancer for which there is no cure, kill myself. That's again a matter of decision, it's a matter of choice, it's a matter of the thinking process, it's a lot goes into that. So, it's again, it's around. I really thinking, but I couldn't find a place for what we wanted to do in this particular book. I maybe working on areas. Working on right now on a project about people who didn't die eventually, but they would always be a pain in the ass. So the professional pains in there. So Diogenes is saying you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Nietzsche, Walter Benjamin. So we always go against. We have the mainstream, the trend itself, the community of philosophers, the universities, and then you have individuals who don't like that individual to go against this thing. So that the founding father is Diogenes. And in that tradition, there's a place for me because he couldn't, at the brilliant mind, couldn't get accepted by the picture in the university was that out is ability to this world. So, very good, but again, another story. But I have a question.
Is there any other question? Is there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm really curious which one thing.
Sí, para la transmisión.
Yeah, I'm really curious because you were talking about pessimism and taking like pessimism in a serious way, and somehow that makes me think how you were talking at the same time how you have to ask these questions, really questions, even when you don't have the answers. And that makes me think like, okay, you somehow have this commitment, this idea of like a proper philosopher that could ask these questions and it's going to be truth and responsibility or some kind of like that. And I don't see, for example, right now, it's like over times, how can we find, for example, like kind of like a relationship between someone that is committed to some philosophical ideas and the ideas in the modern world that are more like be who you are, be authentic. And you're talking about like, life is hard. And somehow you need to learn how to deal with that. You need to learn how to like get these things done and like, keep going. But I'm really interested in how you think that the person like, would be like dealing with like these philosophical ideas, but also having philosophical ideas in the academia that are like saying like avoid pain, avoid suffering. So it's kind of like interesting because it's kind of like a contradiction there. And I think that I see your examples are really good. I don't imagine that happening right now. For example, one thing that you were saying also is like you were afraid of being cancelled. That topic for me is really interesting, like cancel culture. And it's how you could be, how could you relate this cancel culture movement, you know, with someone that would die, you know?
Well, I like that. Well, I used cancel in a project in that text, cancelled by my editor, which is not, it's not so, where the word I should have used would have been censored. So my editor asked me to make, which happens when you write a book, I know it's finished it. You reach a point where you sit down with the editor and he or she goes through every single page and they're asking to make changes, it's not clear enough, you know, the evidence, is it weak, you're stronger. So the right word would have been censored, because that's a different topic and a very important, as you say. I was cancelled, actually. I was afraid of being censored by my editor, which would have managed the book here. But I was censored. I have a history. So when the book of Introduccin came out, I will be cancelled again, which I was cancelled in the very deep way, but I was cancelled and I was, so so it was when the book came out, somebody from the New York Times asked me to write an essay about it. What I know about that, why my news. So I wrote about my growing up in Romania, the leadership and personal difficulties and so on. And there's a bit of a talk there about Romania as a land. It's a place where different empires came and went and occupied the land, and moved on. This country doesn't have a existence. We came, we could occupy the place, moved on. So it was a text about myself, my own roots, my own existence, my own history. But there's a bit of a context there about what happened. So it came out basically on the event, and there was a big furious campaign social media and in different places. Because I learned one statement in my essay that the comfortable place was insignificant as something. I made a number of statements about Romania as an insignificant country. There was this huge campaign. And what happens, I was supposed to give a talk soon after at the Romanian Cultural Institute in New York. It was a public event, it was a book launch like this. And they canceled me. They canceled me because I heard the things. It's not right now, it's not a big deal, but it was it was cancellation when I had the text. And it tastes bitter, and it has a good taste because it's exactly the connection you're making. That's life. Life is bitter. And it's we should if we are to say, if we are to articulate difficult difficulties, we should use translation right now. In different times, in different places, that would be dealt with a more positive response and the dialogue, more civilized communication, but also in different countries and different places that could be dealt with a death sentence. You can take it in Russia right now and say other things, you are out, right? Or Iran or China, right? It's not so. If we are taking this step of saying difficult things, you have to expect cancellation. I'm very interested in, I agree, we can talk if you like. I'm very interested in this thing about cancellation culture and what the university has become lately. I agree with that. Look it up. It's you can look up my name. Unheard. There's a British publication. Unheard. What's the name of it? It's called Academia and Frozen. Power has poison. That's definitely power has poison. So it's a kind of longish essay about the politicization of the especially the Anglo-American of the English speaking world by all those power.
Is there any other question? Okay, so we started planning this event in October last year because it was in October that the Spanish translation of Professor Balatan's book came in Spain. And we hoped that the book was going to be in Colombia by then, but it hasn't arrived yet. We were planning on having a couple of books for you, but it's not here. We went to the Fondo Cultura Económica today to ask, and they said they're going to have a shipment from Anagrama from Mexico the next couple of weeks, but they are not sure whether the book will come with it. So we have a copy of the book that Professor Bradatan kindly brought with him, and we'll have kind of a Hunger Games thing here to see if you want to die for this idea. The one who stands up at the end gets the book. I want to thank Professor Bradatan for his time and for his presence. We have on Friday at 5 at the Edificio El Tiempo, we're going to have a different conversation from his other book, In Price of Failure. So you're all welcome to attend. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
¿Alguna copia de él? ¿Quién se le suma al libro? ¿Cómo lo repartimos? ¿Lo partimos en pedacitos? ¿Cada uno un capítulo?
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.